A long time ago, when I was in college, I had some interesting summer jobs. Two of my summer jobs involved being part of the food concessions crew traveling with a carnival all over the state of Minnesota. The food concession owner is the same people who introduced the footlong hot dog to the Minnesota State Fair. So you kind of get an idea of what we were doing. That experience opened my eyes to a whole lot of things about the world. I remember one night we were in a northern Minnesota town and it had been raining and no one came out to play the games. And without anyone to play the games, the other carnies had no income. I had an eye-opening experience when I discovered that one of the women who ran, I don't know, it was the bottle game or something like that, because the weather had been so bad and there was no income, all she had to give her children for supper was a cup of sugar. I'd never known poverty like that. It changed my point of view on the world. I was fortunate to be in a crew of 7 or 8 college students. Most of us had been raised in church families. We were doing things and going places in our lives. But I saw something different. I saw what it's like to be part of the underside, the neglected, the overlooked, where no one gives a darn whether your children eat at night or not. I had some other interesting experiences too. Some involved being on the receiving end of people's attempts to convert me to Christianity, 4 spiritual laws and all that. Another one was in a campaign year. And I was pretty politically active and interested in college. And a Senate candidate, I'm not going to name names and I'm not going to name parties, but a Senate candidate took up a post right outside my stand because it was at the crossroads of the busiest intersection. I had what I thought were some very intelligent and cogent questions for him, and I was in his district and I was going to be voting. But do you suppose I could get him to give me the time of day? Even when no one was talking to him, he wouldn't acknowledge my respectful request to ask a question because I was just a carny and carnies don't count. Some years later, my daughter and I volunteered with the Interfaith Hospitality Network. Now it's known as Families Moving Forward. It's a program by which churches rotate sheltering homeless families for 1 week at a time. It's a great program. It's also expanding into the Shakopee area, and this past week, Pastor Stephanie and Adrian went to a meeting to find out more about this. Well, I took my daughter, and as it happened, the night we got there was right after a certain mother-daughter argument that we'd had. She was about 10. Some of you know what preteens are like. It was about picking up her stuff. I always told her I could track her movements through the house because there was stuff littered wherever she had dropped it all along the way. I do have her permission to tell these stories, by the way. She's old enough now that it doesn't matter. And when we got to Families Moving Forward, she was still kind of mad at me. But we went out to the vehicles to help the family move in. And she met a girl her own age. And the girl and said, "Hey, let me help." And the girl handed her a plastic bag. And my daughter said, "And what else do you have?" And the girl said, "That's all there is." And in the context of having quarreled over picking up all her junk, to realize there was a little girl the same age whose entire worldly goods fit in a plastic grocery bag changed her life. She began to see that there are people who are suffering in poverty for no fault of their own, but just because that's how things worked out. The gospel reading today ends with the story of a woman who has fallen through the cracks. Jesus is sitting in the courtyard of the temple watching the treasury. That was actually a metal box where people would put in their charitable contributions. The coins were gold or silver or sometimes bronze, maybe copper. They were metal, and the heavier the coin, the bigger the noise it made when it got dropped in the offering box. And being Passover week in Jerusalem, lots of people were coming to the temple. And many people were putting in big offerings that made a lot of noise when it fell into the metal box. But Jesus sat and watched. And as he watched, he saw a widow come up and put in 2 halfpennies, tiny, tiny, thin little copper coins that wouldn't make a sound. And Jesus understood that that was all she had in the world. 1 penny wouldn't buy her food. It wouldn't buy her a place to lay her head. It wouldn't buy her anything. So in what seems to me an act of heroic defiance, she says, well, I can't live, but the least I can do is put my last penny to a good cause. And so she put her 2 halfpennies in the box of the offerings meant for the poor. The question becomes is how, with so many people around, how did this poor woman fall through the cracks? How did it happen that she was down to her last 1 cent with no meal, no bed, no roof to look forward to? And that's a good question. The answer to that is going to tie back to the commandments that Jesus gave us. But first, a little Bible background. As a woman, when you got married, like the scripture says, a man shall leave his mother, and a woman leave her home. That means leave. If things didn't work out, your own birth family, your father, your uncles, your brothers, were under no obligation to take you back and provide for you. You were done. The law did not require that they look after you in any way. And since a woman could not have a job, there was really no way for her to look after herself. But then it gets a little more complicated. This woman is a widow, and when her husband died, she could not inherit his possessions. His property could not go to her. Elsewhere in the Roman Empire, women could and did own property and businesses and all kinds of things. But in the culture Jesus grew up in, it was not allowed. So when someone died, the property all went to whoever the heir was. That could be a son, it could be a brother. Whoever was the next of kin would inherit everything. And under the law, that person was not absolutely required to take in and look after the widow. They were supposed to honor your father and mother and all that. But there was a loophole. Jesus referred to it in another gospel. If the money that you would have spent supporting your parents was declared korban, that means designated, set aside for God, then you didn't have to pay the support of the elderly. I don't know all the details, but something like that has happened, and this woman has no one who is looking after her. The laws of the time and place and the way they were interpreted by people like the scribe meant that she had nowhere to go and nowhere to sleep and no way to get a next meal. She has a penny, she can't do anything with it, so put it in the offering box. Now, I want to know what Jesus did next. I can't imagine my Lord watching all that happening and not doing something, but we're not told what happens there. The story of this woman is so often used as kind of a club to say, you ought to give away everything you've got. And then we all feel guilty about that, and then we say, well, hey, that's unrealistic, and then we just kind of ignore it. But if we look at the whole story in its setting, that's not really what Jesus was talking about. Jesus knows that people need places to live and food on the table and all those other kinds of things. Jesus is a very practical person. What he was doing was pointing out how the laws of the land came into conflict with the law. When the scribe comes up to ask Jesus what's most important, not all the scribes are Jesus' enemies. Here's one who is really intrigued by what he hears in Jesus. He says, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus goes back to Deuteronomy 6 and quotes, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your strength and your neighbor as yourself. Those are the most important of all. And the scribe agrees. He says, you're right. That is much more important than all whole burnt offerings. Let's unpack that a little bit. If you were really poor and wanted to make an offering like Jesus and Mary, or Joseph and Mary when Jesus was a baby, if you were really poor, you might go to the temple and offer 2 doves, because that was the cheapest offering that you could make. But if you were a person of considerable means, you might offer an entire animal, like a whole bull without spot or blemish. A whole burnt offering was extremely expensive, pretty showy, and only the richest of the rich could do that. And Jesus and the scribe are agreeing that loving your neighbor as yourself is more important than a whole burnt offering. By lifting this up and then showing us this widow, Jesus is showing us that the laws of his own people are getting in the way of the most important expectations of God. Love the Lord with everything you got, and love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew, Mark, Luke, they all talk about this. It's that important. Sometimes the laws get in the way. At the end of this week, when it's what we call Maundy Thursday, Jesus gives a new commandment. He says, love one another as I have loved you. That's because Jesus himself is embodying how to love the Lord with everything you got and love your neighbor as yourself. That's his new commandment. We live in a time and place where one-on-one we may see things our neighbors need. Our neighbors may be strangers. Our neighbors might live on our same street. Our neighbors might be family. Our neighbors might be friends. Our neighbors might even be enemies. But all are our neighbors. Love your neighbor as yourself. Don't say what you wouldn't want said to you. Don't take from another what you wouldn't want taken from you. It is so simple, so straightforward, and so very, very difficult. That's the word that Jesus has for us. And when he pointed out that widow, he was showing how people were not fulfilling the call to love their neighbor as themselves. Else that widow wouldn't have been down to her last penny. Else my fellow carny wouldn't have been down to 1 cup of sugar. Else a little girl's family wouldn't have been thrown out on the street with nothing but a plastic grocery bag to her name. How does that work out in our lives? Well, that's the hard part. We try and figure it out as a society in our politics. We try and figure it out as families in our giving plans. We try and figure it out as individuals in our daily relationships. It's a work in progress. I can't tell you exactly what it's going to look like in your life today or tomorrow. For heaven's sake, I can't even tell you what it's going to look like in my life today or tomorrow. We work on this as we go along. But what God expects of us is really so simple. Love one another as He has loved us. In other words, love your neighbor as yourself. Not more than yourself, and surely not less than yourself, but in the same way that you would like to be cared for. There is no greater commandment than these. Amen.